Hey there, everyone. Dean here. Today we're going to be going through Act 4 of King Lear. So, essentially, how I decided to format this was I'm going to go through essentially a summary of what happens in the play, and then we're going to get into some analysis, talking about some of the main themes, and then some quotes that stood out to me. So, strap in your seatbelts. Let's get this show on the road. All right. So, scene one. We see Edgar disguised as this poor madman named Tom. So Edgar's father, who is Gloucester, he's now blinded, right? He cannot see. So he finds Edgar with the help of an old man. But he thinks that Edgar is Tom, right? So he says this quote, and it's going to show up later. He says, "I have no way, and therefore I want no eyes." And essentially, he says this because he understands that having eyes didn't help him see what was right in front of his face. Like, it didn't help him see the truth. So Gloucester asks the old man to go find some clothes for Tom, and then asks Tom to help him get to the cliffs of Dover. So then we move on to scene two. And in scene two, we see Goneril and Oswald talking. And Goneril's like, "I don't know why my husband's so mad at me," right? And so we enter Edmund, and he needs to go back to Cornwall's house, right? Goneril kisses him on the cheek and is so clearly infatuated with him. The only problem here is that if we remember from, I don't know, about 15 seconds ago, she has a husband, whose name is Albany. So Albany comes in and he's a little angry, and rightfully so. So Albany is not very thrilled about how Goneril and her sister have treated King Lear. And then he finds out about Gloucester getting blinded and then Cornwall being killed, and he is horrified at this point. So then you look over to her, right? And Goneril is conflicted, and not even because of all of the pain and strife that she's caused. No, she's conflicted because now, if Cornwall is dead, then that means that her sister Regan could steal her man, right? And not Albany, Edmund. So this is really interesting because two sisters have the same infatuation with this man. Um, However, Albany, learning everything that he learns, he vows to take revenge on Edmund for betraying Gloucester, because Edmund is the one that essentially left so that Cornwall could punish Gloucester. Also, if I say any of these names wrong, it's because they're hard and they're very interesting names. So, yeah. Alright, moving on to scene 3. So we're back to Cordelia. She's the Queen of France now. So that happened. Um, Kent, who's essentially disguised, um, gets news of the troops and of what happened to King Lear, and how Cordelia has essentially been really torn up about it. And Cordelia essentially expresses that she wants to help and defend King Lear, who's her father, despite how he treated her, because as we remember from previous acts, um, King Lear essentially ousted her completely. And then we move on to scene 4. So in scene 4, Cordelia comes in with her soldiers trying to find Lear, right? And this man has gone mad. he's hidden himself away, he's in the cornfields, he's singing to himself, and they're trying to find him. So she sends her soldiers out to find him. And then Cordelia asks a doctor if there's anything to do to bring her father's sanity back. And essentially the doctor just says he needs, some medicine and he just needs to sleep. Another, war update, the Cornwall and Albany armies are coming. But Cordelia, already expected it. She's ready. Her troops are there. They're good to go. And then we get into scene 5. So, scene 5 is when we see Reagan again. And she gets news about the army setting out. And she wants to know what the letter Goneril sent to Edmund says, right? So, Oswald won't tell her. So Reagan tells Oswald that she wants Edmund for herself, right? And that it would be better if she had him over Goneril because she's a widow and Goneril's not, right? That's the whole thing. So Edmund gives Oswald a letter to give, or Reagan gives Oswald a letter to give to Edmund. She also tells him that she'll reward him if he can find and kill Gloucester. Sort of, tying up all loose ends here. And then we're on to scene 6. So Edgar, we're all the way back to Edgar now. We haven't seen him in a little bit, but he's here. So Edgar, he's still disguised as Tom, and he brings Gloucester to Dover, right? And he pretends essentially, and remember, Gloucester's blind, he doesn't know. So he pretends to bring him to the highest cliffs, right? He doesn't actually. So he prays to the gods to forgive him because Gloucester essentially wants to kill himself. He's gotten to a point where he's like, I can't do this anymore. I'm suffering, right? And then he faints, onto the ground. Edgar wakes him up a little bit later. He still doesn't reveal that he's his son, but he's not, going by Tom anymore. And essentially says, oh, we saw you fall from the cliff, and you're alive. Obviously, the gods don't want you dead. And then so Gloucester's like, aw, damn. Well, if the gods don't want me dead, I guess I'll just suffer. So that happens. And then immediately after that, they find King Lear wandering around. And he's obviously, again, mad. And Cordelia's men find them there, but Lear runs away again. And that's when Oswald finds Gloucester and Edgar, and tries to kill Gloucester, but Edgar kills Oswald first. He's like, nah, man, not today. And then Edgar reads the letter that Reagan sent with Oswald, and it essentially tells Edmund to kill Albany so Goneril and him can be together. Things are getting a little tricky. And so then we enter the last scene of this act. And so it's pretty quick. So King Lear is brought to Cordelia, and he thinks that Cordelia wants to kill him. He's like, you know what? You're right. You should want to kill me. And then Cordelia essentially says, no, I forgive you. You did a bad thing, but I'm your daughter. It's a whole moment, right? And so now here's another update on the troops. Edmund is leading the Cornwall's troops now in wake of his death. So no troops are out of the game, and the battle is coming. And that's essentially where it ends off. So now we're going to go into some analysis. It's going to be super cool. And I'll try to do it as quickly as possible because I don't, this is going to run over, but it's fine. So, the first thing we need to talk about are the key themes here. I tried to make it specific to Act 4, but some of it overlaps. So the key theme that you can definitely see is nihilism. Um, and this is because, well, if you don't know what nihilism is, it's essentially like the whole thing of like um, sort of a change in identity, if that makes any sense. It's like losing like these pieces that used to mean a lot to you, and then sort of coming to the realization that life is meaningless, right? And that happens a lot through this play, especially with um, like Gloucester and King Lear. And then justice is also plays a really big part in this, because everyone like thinks that someone has been wronged and then tries to fix it and figure it out, and it just keeps making like more messes essentially. And then seeing, as we saw in I believe it's the first scene, is also like really big throughout the entire play, but most especially in this act, because even like from the beginning, like Gloucester is talking about how, I like had sight, but I couldn't see anything. Um, and like it's really metaphorical like that, but it's really symbolic of this whole idea that like seeing the truth isn't as simple as we think it is. And then forgiveness is a really big theme. Anytime that Cordelia is mentioned, she like is this example of forgiveness for her father, right? Who essentially ousted her out of the kingdom completely. Um, and even so, she still vows to forgive him, and not only forgive him, but defend him. So that's a really big part as well. So we're going to go into some of the quotes. I picked about 4. So we already talked about this one, but it's where Gloucester says, "I have no way and therefore want no eyes. I stumbled when I saw." And this is like a really big theme, but it's also a really important quote, and I think it's one of my favorites personally, because it essentially talks about how he doesn't need sight anymore because he has the truth, and sight didn't help him see that. So then we go into another one, which is kind of really important. It's when King Lear is talking, and he says, "For Gloucester's bastard son was kinder to his father than my daughters." And it sort of calls into question this idea of illegitimate children, right? And how maybe it's not as complicated as people make it out to be, right? Because everyone's like, oh, that's not like my real kid, right? And then we get to this point where we realize that, King Lear's quote unquote real daughters have essentially, you know, caused all kinds of ruckus. And yet, Gloucester's son, who, like, was, born illegitimately and all that nonsense, has somehow, like, become this person and this model to, like, look towards. Alright. And then, the next 2 are essentially going to be about nihilism. Um, and I believe they're both quotes from King Lear in this act. So, the first one is, "When we are born, we cry that we are come to this great stage of fools." And essentially, this part I think is really interesting because he's essentially saying that, like, from the moment that we are born, from the moment that we grace this earth, we already know that life is gonna suck. And I think, for me at least, when I was reading it, I have like a really like sarcastic type of humor, so I read that and immediately laughed. Um, because like in a way, it's kind of true, right? Um, but it's it's a very like nihilistic way to look at life, and that's like a really big theme of this play. And then we get to the last one, um, which is I am bound upon a wheel of fire. And this part in specific, it happens in the last act. I'm not in the last act, in the last scene. And at this point, King Lear has sort of not necessarily given up, but realized a lot of things. And not even just about himself, but just about life in general and the world. And he comes to this realization that he's not in control of anything anymore, and that life um, isn't something like you don't happen to life happens to you, and that's sort of where this goes, of the whole I'm just here and things are happening and it's not in my control, but eventually I'm gonna die and it's not gonna mean anything. Um, so yeah, dark note to leave off of, but here we find ourselves. So at the end of Act 4, we realize that um, Gloucester and King Lear not doing so hot, and there's definitely an impending battle. So I will see you in class. I really hope that you enjoyed this, and um, sounds good. Yeah, later.